Sounds like the audio is working in the room. If anyone online wants to say in the chat that they can hear us, that'd be great. So welcome. This is a panel discussion on the MUN resolution, Resolution 77336, progress and next steps. And we've got a really lovely panel here to discuss that resolution, what progress has been made since it was adopted, what next steps, what challenges, all that kind of thing. We'll start with the quick round of introductions. Why don't we start online with Finn?
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me okay. My name is Finn Kaufman. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the Co-Founder of United Nations Association. Sorry I don't join you in person today, but I'm very much looking forward to the panel and contributing virtually. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Andrew, you want to take it from there?
Sure. Thank you. My name is Andrew Murad. I'm the co-founder of the United Nations Youth of Canada. I organize conferences, MUN conferences all over Quebec and Ontario. I'm also a senior program officer at the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, which works around research and granting agencies. So thank you all for being here.
Hi everyone, my name is FeiFei Hua, and I am the co-founder of Youth MUN United Nations Conference in China, and we host conferences across 6 to 7 different cities in China. Very nice seeing everyone and looking forward to having the conversation.
Hello everyone, my name is Vitorino Oliveira. I'm a Portuguese diplomat at the United Nations, and I was the one who wrote this resolution, so I'm very happy to share with you the process and discuss its implementation. Thank you so much.
Great. And my name is Chase Mitchell. I probably should have started with myself, but I forgot. I'm moderating the panel. I've started doing Model UN as a student in 2011, and I've been involved with NMUN as an organization since 2015. Great. So I was thinking about how to open up this panel and what questions to get us started, and we will be taking questions from anyone in the room or online. If you come up with questions online, feel free to pop them in the chat or in the Q&A at any time. If you're in the room, we'll get started with a couple questions, and then we'll welcome any questions from people in the room. So keep them in the back of your head for now. We kind of find ourselves in an era, I think, where trust in institutions, and especially multilateral institutions, seems to be waning, to put it nicely. And I think Model UN is a great tool for not only UN outreach, but kind of rebuilding that faith in institutions. So I think it's apt for us to be talking about this. The name of the panel kind of begets 2 immediate questions, so I'll start with the first one. It's been a little bit now since the Model UN resolution passed, and it feels like we are in a different universe than when it did. So what progress has been made in terms of the UN supporting Model UN, reaching out to youth directly? What are member states doing? What have you seen that has improved as a result of the passage of the resolution, or related to that? I'll open it up to anyone who cares to answer first.
Okay, I can start. So I'll probably give you a little bit of context before, if you don't know what this resolution is. But before talking about its implementation, if that's okay. So the resolution, the idea for this resolution started being discussed around 2 years ago, when a group of diplomats at the UN, me included, started to discuss about our participation in events like this, in events where we come and see young people participating in simulations of Model United Nations, which we felt not just as very interesting, and it's encouraging for us diplomats to see that there are opportunities for young people to experience diplomacy in first hand through Model UN simulations. Not all diplomats have done Model UNs. I hadn't heard of Model UNs before coming here to New York, but learned about this as an initiative that promotes diplomacy and the work of the United Nations, and understood its value. And so what we first decided to see was, well, is there any way we can use the UN power, the power of the organization as an entity, to further support model UNs? Because model UNs were not or are not being organized by the UN itself, by diplomats themselves, by the Secretariat, but by organizations, NGOs, universities, high schools, spontaneously. So there's not a guidance on, you should do model events like this, and this is the official way to do it. And because we understood this was important, we also tried to understand, okay, what has the UN done so far for model UNs? Is there any resolution at all from the General Assembly on model UNs? And I could ask you if you know if there's any resolution before this one, but the answer is, you can expect it. The answer is no. There had never been a resolution from the UN on model UNs. So in 77 years, since 1945, with more or less 300 resolutions adopted every year by the General Assembly, none of them mention what you guys do here, model UNs, although thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of young people are simulating UN negotiations. And so the idea, I'm sorry to take a little bit of time, but just to explain, the idea was, okay, let's try to adopt a resolution that at the very least recognizes that model UNs exist and that they are valuable, and for what, okay? And so this was a process, and I would be happy to explain a little bit how it happened. But we basically drafted a resolution, negotiated alongside different developments in geopolitics and world diplomacy that were, of course, more important, I would say, as well. But we were able to pass a resolution, 77/336, and it was the resolution that year with the most co-sponsorships across the board. So no other resolution had so many member states, so many countries supporting and saying we want to be co-sponsors of this resolution. And so the question is valid, and I'm getting there finally. What has been done since then? It's a hard question because the resolution didn't necessarily mandate a report or a debate or a model UN conference to happen. It encouraged member states to support model UNs, like Portugal is doing today with the Model UN Summit, or we do by supporting and sponsoring conferences around the world, namely in Portugal, of course. It mandated the UN Secretariat to be more supportive in welcoming model UN organizations to the UN itself, to visit the General Assembly, the Security Council, do some sessions there, to allow for staff members to go as speakers to events of model UNs. And it encouraged as well the UN system to participate, so that we not just simulate negotiations in the General Assembly, the Security Council, so the principal bodies of the UN, but also of WHO, UNICEF, so the executive boards of the different agencies, funds, and programs. And that, I think, has allowed for some awareness of model UNs to be more present in our discussions as diplomats. And time has gone by. We see more and more colleagues participating in model UNs and bringing model UNs to the UN. But there's still a long way to go, and we can discuss what else can be done. But mostly, we see now the latest news, this is 1 week fresh, is that we are setting up a group of friends of countries that will want to promote more model UN culture within the UN as a system, and identify precisely what else we can do to continue supporting model UNs, not just in New York, which is important for sure, but around the world, namely in developing countries and those that are less aware of model UN as an initiative. Thank you. Long answer, sorry.
Great.
Good answer.
Any other thoughts on, do things, I guess we'll just take the microphone. Any other thoughts on, do things feel different in the model UN world since the passage of the resolution, I guess is another way to phrase the question. So we've got the diplomat side.
Yeah, I'll share a bit from a perspective of a model UN organizer. I've never been really involved in the UN, but I've done model UN for more than 10 years. And in model UN, we've seen a lot of young people really passionate about global issues and really want to know how the UN works. So for us, like a resolution like 77/336 is a really meaningful milestone. And definitely after that, we can see model UN being more widely acknowledged in the civil society. So having a conversation like this is also extremely meaningful and exciting. Thank you.
We've been unmuted.
Maybe it's a good time to come in and have a hard time picking up vendor for a moment, so apologies if I cut anyone off. But maybe to add a little bit to what has been done. One of the things the resolution calls for is there is a UN guide in model UN that was written a number of years ago, and the resolution calls for that guide to be translated into all official languages. So far, it's been translated into French, Portuguese, and Korean. And recently, the United Nations Association of China signed an MOU with the UN to also translate it into Chinese. That means there's still some languages missing. However, this is a really great step to make information to model units more accessible on how the UN works. Another example that where I can draw from our side, the resolution doesn't just call on member states in the UN to do things, but also on civil society organizations. So I think the burden is also very much on us as model UN organizations to push for the change we want to see. And one initiative that I want to highlight that we've been able to collaborate with WHO directly, we signed a MOU with WHO to now host the global model WHO, which is the first ever simulation of its kind where the UN entity that is being simulated is co-hosting the event. And that has come with lots of new opportunities and access for participants. And this is a really great route, in our opinion, for the UN to engage. And this was a really encouraging sign that there was this support and this buy-in for an initiative like this from the WHO end. And we, of course, hope that there will be more initiatives like this moving forward. But yeah, very much I think it's also important that we don't just look at, hey, let's wait for the member states or the UN to do something, but rather let's use our passion and enthusiasm for model UN to push for more things to be done as well.
If I may maybe chime in a little bit here. Also, like FeiFei, more on the organizational level. I think, and I apologize, Chase, if I jump ahead a little bit, but I think the question should be oriented in a way that we can think forward, because unfortunately, not because of the resolution itself having, impact or no impact. I think the world as itself had a lot of, influence on people's minds and ideology, and the lack of diplomacy. More and more we see, even in model United Nations environment, people, hiding from differences to buy peace. And it's something that I'm worried about, because more and more professors and universities and so on, even government in some instances, shy from sharing their real opinions and having a real debate on matters, on issues that matters to all. We perhaps are scared of what's going on, and we're not allowing for debate to grow. So from my perspective, what we have to do with this resolution, which is great on itself because it gives us a very general idea of what is supposed to, happen in the United Nations models and simulations. I think we have to empower youth and their differences and their opinions and give them a safe space to debate and try methods to negotiate and work in diplomatic environment, because yes, it's a simulation, and yes, it's we're mocking or trying to at least put ourselves in your shoes at the UN, but not giving them the responsibility to debate and negotiate and tell your truth, and go forward with it, build a certain opinion and build relationships, people that have different opinions, is dangerous for our future. So my perspective on this is that we have to use experiential learning to humanize international issues and foster empathy and global citizenship. We really have to empower youth and their action at the Model United Nations, but not only here in New York or any conference, but also in their professional careers, just keeping in mind what they have learned in the Model United Nations environment, and deal with these situations in a simulation, but also learn from them and deal with the same situation or similar situation in their professional careers, and that may have an impact on our world. But I think not because of the resolution itself or not because of anyone's fault. I think the world as itself today has hindered in some sort people sharing opinions. So we've been seeing it in classrooms, we've been seeing it in Model United Nations. More and more people are scared of sharing their opinions, and professors are not wanting to deal with it in a way. So they kind of hide and say, "Oh, let's be diplomatically acceptable and vote every single resolution by acclamation or consensus," which doesn't always happen that way, and especially on very hot topics. And when we debate, wars or climate change, and we push people to just, say the same rationales, I think it doesn't help us in any way. I think because more and more I will use the resolution to negotiate with institutions. And it gives us a lot of legitimacy within institutions, within governmental bodies, with other partners, because I also live in a rational world, not only in a simulation, and we have restriction in resources. There's a lack of investments in those activities. We hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, I'm going to a football, competition. My parents are paying everything. The school is, throwing away money. But when it comes to Model UN, we have to go and do a lot of, financial activities to, make it the most possible, the cheapest possible for students." And it's becoming more and more an activity that is more and more expensive, especially coming from Canada, where the exchange rate today is getting crazy. But I mean, that's my point of view, and I think we should look forward. I don't think what the past has given us is accurate for the future. I think we have to look at it as an exponential growth, and I'm hoping for that. But again, Vitorino, thank you very much for your work, and I think it's going to help us all, go forward in this context.
Thank you. That's a great transition, and I'll take one half step back and one step forward. Just from a practical perspective, it feels like there is a lot more awareness, especially among UN staff, diplomats, perm reps, about Model UN as a result of the resolution, and engaging with them has become a lot easier as a result. And there seems to be a lot more willingness to come and make themselves visible at Model UNs. you kind of started digging into some of the challenges, of which there are a multitude, and some of the next steps. So I'll open that up to the panel in a second. It seems like you're also challenging or poking at two realities. And I kind of hinted at the beginning about multilateralism and belief in institutions is struggling. You talked about students being unable to confront opposition. And that's true, and we see that in a lot of Model UNs where people just put stuff in a working paper and agree to it without really critically assessing whether or not they should. And I've said before, I long for a day when there's a committee that spends the entire conference in, rigorous argument over a few words, and they never even adopt a draft resolution. But the argument is so interesting and so good that doesn't even matter. But it's hard, and you're right. There is a generational issue about not wanting to confront things, and professors are doing it, and everyone's doing it. So taking all of this into account, I guess my question that I'll open up to everyone else that you've already started diving into is, what are the next steps? How do we increase engagement from the UN to Model UNs such that it is granted more legitimacy? And how do we take Model UNs and make it so that they are more about learning about the actual UN system and engaging in rigorous debate and confronting bad ideas that seem to be very popular nowadays? So it's a little bit open-ended from both perspectives, but you kind of gave me a launch pad. So I'll kick it back to the rest of you and challenges and next steps, and how do we fix the world, I guess.
Okay. Thank you. So that's a great question. I think there's different aspects to be discussed here. So one is where are we at in terms of multilateralism and negotiations at the UN in general? Because you were talking about trust and or distrust in multilateralism, the fading away of this form of negotiation and favoring, especially from, of course, led by the new US administration, more bilateral negotiations and so on. And so we can talk a little bit about that, and I will. The second one is, okay, so what is happening in Model UN as a whole? For that, I would rely more on your opinions, your views, and of course, it's harder to get a sense. There's fewer information, less data from around the world on the different Model UNs that exist and how challenging times can be for a Model UN to thrive. And then there's the link between the two that you were mentioning, which is how do we allow a system that in itself is struggling to continue supporting simulations, education, and allowing these spaces, which I think you were mentioning is very important, for people to feel safe to practice these skills of diplomacy, of negotiation, which I think Model UN would be a natural fit. So before you enter the labor market, be it as a diplomats or as something else, having the ability to practice how to negotiate, how to speak in public, how to argue with your colleagues, and Model UNs should offer that safe space. And so for the first part, yes, so the UN has faced over the decades many times of distrust, and there's ups and downs. We are clearly in a down point, or at least in a downward trend. If you look, for instance, at the Security Council, because that's the easiest one and everybody's looking at the Security Council. The Security Council last year had the most number and hours of meetings since the end of the Cold War, so since the 1990s. Most number of meetings, but the fewest number of products adopted. So resolutions, decisions, press statements, presidential notes, the least amount for the highest amount of meetings. Maybe there's a problem of productivity, but maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's more on the trust side of things. And there was also the highest number of vetoes last year since 1989 as well. So that brings us to a place where you see that the UN is having a harder time negotiating by consensus, which is, of course, something that would be desirable in the end. And at the same time, you see the difficulty in for the UN to implement its own mandates. So funding is under threat, and a lot of funding has been cut already. The negotiations on the budget of the UN have been particularly tense over the last 5 years. And that means there's also fewer margin to support, negotiations that the UN has around the world, but also the support to Model UN, for instance, in this mandate. So the other day we were making a rough assessment, and the UN since 1945 has more than 9,000 mandates. Okay, so this UN resolution on Model UN is one mandate, and so if funding is lacking, if political will for multilateralism is also at peril in some countries, how do we translate these into further support? Of course, we're trying to identify specific actions. One way is to try to organize more events like these and invite in the room not just youth and organizations that care about Model UNs, but also youth that doesn't know about Model UN. So try to reach out to as many countries and as many organizations that we can in high schools, universities, to explain the benefits of Model UNs, encourage students to organize. One of the things that we feel, and in Portugal, we didn't have many Model UN organizations. We had a lot of Model UN students that would go to other countries and participate in Model UNs. But one thing that we started to understand when going as diplomats, for instance, to universities, explaining how diplomacy works, what's the work of a diplomat, and then in the end encourage them to organize Model UNs or model other organization. One of the things that we notice is that a student that has never participated in one Model UN would have a lot of difficulty, and it doesn't take rocket science to understand that, to organize, even if he sees that this is something exciting. So there needs to be this possibility for students to go maybe first abroad, maybe first to a big organization. And one of the challenges that you're mentioning is the financial support, because of course it remains of a sort of an elite type of activity. People who can come to New York and spend 10 days here at their own expenses is expensive. You all know that. And so how do we bring more this Model UN culture to the local level? And COVID helped a lot because it generated lots of virtual Model UNs as well. That's something that we should definitely try to encourage. The second one is try to raise awareness amongst member states. So for me as a diplomat, negotiating this Model UN resolution, I didn't know what Model UNs were, but made an effort to understand. But then tried to reach out to countries and colleagues that had done Model UNs themselves. There's not a portfolio of Model UNs in the UN, so I wouldn't be able to call a colleague from, say, the UK and say, are you the one responsible for Model UNs? Let's negotiate a draft on Model UNs. Doesn't exist. So I would have to say, oh, maybe the one that is in charge of resolutions that talk about youth knows a little bit about Model UNs. Maybe the one that is responsible of general affairs in the UN will be encouraged to work on Model UNs. But 90% of my colleagues as diplomats in the UN either didn't know what the Model UN was, thought it was something from the West, a Western activity to stimulate elites in the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, or it was something of an alternative project for the UN, such as a UN 2.0. Let's start taking decisions in civil society and let youth decide on how governments should take their own decisions. And so there was a question of sovereignty and, you know, whether this follows the principles of the charter and so on. And so there was, and still is, a lack of awareness from diplomats themselves about what model UNs are and how important and universal they can be. And so doing more efforts to reach out to these diplomats so that they fund events like this one, they fund model UN events in their own countries, bring their universities to understand what these activities, how these activities can be organized. There's still a long way to go, but fortunately, we are all committed to model UNs, and so I'm optimistic that we will continue thriving and pushing model UN culture ahead. Sorry, again, a very long answer, and I'll pass to another one.
I just to pick up on the topic of accessibility that Vitorino talked about, because this is something that's been discussed in the broader modeling community for a while. How do you make modeling more accessible? I think this is something we really have to think about when we're talking about the next step, also coming from this resolution. On the one hand, you have what Vitorino mentioned, going to universities and schools and raising awareness around them. But also there's the question of, how can we make sure everyone has the possibility to participate? Not everyone, as Vitorino rightfully mentioned, has the funds to travel to New York and participate in a conference. And even if it's not all the way to New York, right? Even if it's a local conference, many of them charge fees, etc. And there are barriers towards people who have the means to participate in this. So how can we way from allowing them to be seen as elitist? One of the things we've been trying with, I have to say, moderate success. I think there's still a lot more that can be done. Is the concept of twinning, meaning you try to get schools, universities that are a little bit more wealthy to not only support their own students, but also sponsor one or two other students from underdeveloping or less developed countries to participate, to try to even out the playing field a little bit, to raise awareness. The other thing that I think is really important, again, not everyone at the UN is centered around New York. There is actually a resolution and recognition of the UN information centers, which are all around the world. I think this would be a really great resource for model UNs around the world to reach out to their local UN information center and try to get more support from them. This may not be financial, but at least in terms of credibility. We've talked briefly about how I think that we mentioned how this resolution can now help in conversations with institutions that, hey, there's something that's recognized here, and getting this further support from the information center, or maybe even just knowledge, maybe getting a guest speaker from the UN Information Center or some resources that can be shared with students to compare can be really helpful to really sort of take things one step at a time. Right? I don't think it's realistic for us to say, especially in our current times, we're going to change the world in one day. We're going to really take it one step at a time. We're going to get to a point where everyone at the UN immediately knows model UN, and it's a program that everyone loves and has all the support it needs. But rather, we need to go there as the one step after the other, and sometimes we have to start small. And it might just be a collaboration with the UN Information Center that gets the ball rolling on getting someone to think about that, hey, this program is actually really great. What else can we do to support it in the region? And maybe that person ends up going on back to working at HQ and continue to positive change there. So accessibility is a really important point. I think that we need to think about when we're talking about next steps and how we can go about making conferences around the world accessible to anyone, and then how we can work something looking just local support networks of the UN to really get collaboration going for conferences and programs.
Either of you more to add? Don't go up.
Okay. I'll be shorter on this one. because I agree with both Vitorino and Finn online. But I'll like to expand on Finn's comments here and saying, the locality of the events in the Model UN, starting from, your communities can be a game changer. And when we organize MUN conferences in Canada, all of our staff are youth, are students, young professionals. We empower them to take decisions. We empower them to make changes. We empower them to give their ideas on how the conference should look like and how we should develop it to make it better, or at least give a better experience to our students the next years. So I think we should start younger for the next steps, if I may. The challenges I've talked about them in the first intervention, but the next steps maybe start younger. There's a lot of high schoolers in the United States, but it's mostly in the United States that participate in this kind of event, but less and less in other regions. But we can do it, locally and give them, time and include them in conferences for high schoolers. So that's something there. And when we were talking about it before the panel started, is that I like to start younger because they haven't chosen their field of studies and they haven't chosen their careers. But in saying that, I mean, if you teach them or you give them tools to negotiate and you share with them information about the SDGs, about how to be, nice to another person that has a different opinion, then that translates to wherever they go professionally. And if they're a doctor, great. If they're an entrepreneur, then they know about the SDGs and the importance of it worldwide. So I tend to like to start younger for them to have this kind of this background experience when they get to that professional level. And I've seen former students, build companies, but have half of their websites on SDGs and how they implement SDGs in their products. And I've seen doctors, having, that kind of behavioral skill to negotiate with the patient that is not cooperating. We've seen lawyers also, former Model United Nations students becoming lawyers, and most of them choose path not against anything about commercial lawyers, but climate change actions, United Nations lawyers, international lawyers, people that change their path because they've learned about something else than what those institutions teach them. And usually it's whatever makes the most money in some instances. So I think starting younger is the next step, but also starting locally. Empower the people that are around you, include them in the events, include them in decisional making position. And I think that's my next steps, at least.
Can I quickly?
Yeah.
Thanks. I really want to echo the point on making this locally relevant, because in China, we've seen actually, besides the major conferences, there are a lot of grassroots, small scale conferences, but they usually lack the support, both financial support and also the opportunity to really learn from the UN, from real diplomats or UN professionals. They don't have the financial capacity to do it. And because in China, UN, it's really, really far away from us, right? We don't really discuss these global issues on a daily basis. So students who go to these small scale local conferences, they don't actually get to learn that much about the UN, because there isn't just because students themselves, they organize them. There's no professionals there to really give more support and professional knowledge. So I would definitely like to see more support given to these small scale grassroots organizations. And another thing is I would really like the youth to really see the impact of their work, because a lot of speakers have mentioned today that Model UN is a very good opportunity for experiential learning. People learn through experience by doing, but one very important part of learning is that meaningful learning happens when you see the impact of your actions, right? But most discussion that happen in the Model UN, they only stay in the conference rooms. They don't go beyond that. So I would definitely like to see more youth involvement in the real UN system.
Yeah, great points all around. Starting younger, it's funny, I barely knew about the UN, much less Model UN, until I was in college, and I wonder what the trajectory of my life would have been like if that hadn't been the case. A quick plug, the development of Model UN in the global south, but in many different countries has often started with like one person really giving it a go. There's been a lot of activity in Nigeria, India, China, Japan, and a lot of it started with somebody who just really wanted Model UN to be a thing where they were. So, it doesn't have to be, we've got people online, we've got a number of people in the room. It doesn't have to be a big event. It can be a single room that you got for free from, your university or whatever. You can get it started. So don't be afraid to get out there and try to do it. Small scale, how many people do you need to run a security council? Not that many, right? So that's how most Model UN start. They don't start like NMUN New York or one of the other big ones. They often start small. All right, so let's open it up to any questions in the room, questions online. Any thoughts? Do you want to come up and ask into the microphone so everyone can hear you?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for coming and for sharing your experience, your thoughts, your expertise, valuable information. Really enjoyed this discussion. I myself, I'm a teacher and I'm a Model UN sponsor back in the state of Florida. And, I really appreciate the resolution for what it sets out to do. And a lot of the comments and the information that's been shared about collaborating with MUN organizations, MUN organizations. And one thing that I'm wondering if you could speak more about or think more about is in terms of supporting simulation of the US from the UN on an organizational level, the UN missions, and what kind of things this would include. So for example, I know the United Nations, there's a yearly agenda set by the General Assembly. So could we have something like a yearly MUN agenda, for example, that provides some kind of guidance to organizations? Because throughout the world, there's a lot of organizations that do MUN, but there's not a lot of collaboration. There is some, and hopefully there's an increasing amount, but there isn't a lot of direct collaboration with the United Nations and with UN organizations, particularly here in the United States, for instance. So could we set some kind of agenda, create resources, right? So resources for simulations based on that agenda, because a lot of MUNs here in the United States, yes, we cover much of that agenda, but then there's also a lot of things in those conferences, in those simulations that don't have much to do with the United Nations at all and are much more focused on the kind of skills that you get from MUN, but they're not really United Nations, international organizations, or things like that. So creating resources for simulation, training opportunities, resources, and then opportunities to also partner with a lot of the organizations that are already doing MUN. So for example, here in the US, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of them private, that are providing some of that training, some of those resources. So exploiting that, right, by partnering with them and trying to align what the goals are in terms of supporting what they do and trying to expand what they do all over.
Great. So kind of three questions in one.
Yeah. A lot of thoughts.
Which I appreciate. Yeah. You just got me imagining what if there were like background guides out there that any conference could use rather than having which could be interesting. That's immediately what I thought of, because so many conferences struggle to make preparatory materials. But let's open it up to answer any or all.
I'll be shorter. These are great questions, and these are precisely questions that we are trying to assess, at least as diplomats. One is on the resources side. So there is this Model UN guide that was mentioned by Finn, if I'm not wrong, which which is an effort from the UN to explain, to give some basic principles on how to organize model UNs without prescribing exactly the rules, but showcasing what's the typical format of a model UN, where you can find that information. That model UN guide, so I'm just doing a little pitch for Portugal as well, but that model UN guide was available in English and in French. It's being sold online, the digital format, and in the bookstore. Portugal decided to translate to Portuguese and make it available for free in that website. So the website has the Model UN guide in Portuguese free, but the English and the French version for a cost, which in our view doesn't make sense. It should be available for free in all languages. But to the best of our control, we can only make it available the version that we translated. So if you want to take it and then translate it to English through any digital platform, you can do it. But so we make this resource available for free. The other thing that we are trying to do is to make it available in the UN website, which we do not control, it's the Secretariat, of course, but member states can push for things to change, to make it there available, links to conferences. And of course, there's a service that does that. My MUN is a very famous website where you have thousands of conferences there. But at what point can we have, for instance, a collaboration with the UN itself so that you are aware of the conferences that exist around the world, organized by any entity? The backlog of guides, papers, it's a little bit trickier to work with that because, of course, you start not just talking about organizational issues, but you start talking about perhaps position papers, opinions, supposedly assessments of how the world is behaving and how each country is behaving. So at what point can you have these being made available formally by the UN? It's a little bit trickier, but for sure we need to explore how to make it at least the speeches that we have, the formal speeches, more easily available through the UN platforms. So that's another way to think about. So I'm mostly talking about the resourcing side. But then, of course, having member states encouraged and the UN system to go to these conferences, participate virtually, I can speak for myself as a diplomat. I accept to come in a room where there's 7 people talking about model UNs or 3,000. Last week, I went to a virtual event from Portugal, of course, so I will accept every single event from Portugal, where there were 8 persons that never had done model UNs in their lives, so they had very basic questions. And I was very happy to spend 1 hour with them, as I am happy to go to an event organized by Italy, for instance, with 3,000 students in a full room, where questions are maybe different. And I'm not saying this because, I want to explain what diplomats should do, but the encouragement for diplomats to do more and more these types of outreach is important. And it needs to come sometimes from youth themselves to ask from their representatives in the UN to do more for them, to come to their events, to explain how it is to work at the United Nations, and to contribute in a way to their model UN initiatives in the end. Because it's not diplomats here in New York that will organize a model UN for sure, but the knowledge, the know-how, the experience that they have will be beneficial for sure for anyone around the world who wants to make a change, and one person can make a difference, as you were explaining very well. And if you have more questions,
Yes,
or someone else can.
Other questions? Yeah. It's a long walk.
There's a little suspense. It's okay.
Never apologize.
Hi, my name is Anud. I'm a senior at Stony Brook University. I actually founded this International Law Society on our campus because we're pretty much like a STEM-based school, so there wasn't much opportunities for international relations. But I used to serve at our MUN, and I really appreciated what you were saying, that there are a lot of students who kind of fear being on like the front lines or being too vocal about the current issues that are going on in this world. So I wanted to ask if there was any kind of reliable, reputable sources to kind of back those students, especially with this current wave of student suppression on campuses, and just like how we as student organizers can kind of facilitate those resources.
Well, I'm very curious if anyone has good answers to this.
Thank you. Thank you for the very difficult question, because I'm not sure if there's any resources, unfortunately. If there are, please let me know, anyone in the room. The other thing I can say maybe about, youth engagement in today's, world events and stuff like that. I mean, you have to make sure that your opinion is respected, unfortunately, because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation, as we all know, things circulating, etc. Just make sure that you're objective in the way you're approaching any crisis, and that's something we try to teach a lot to our students and MUN conferences, is to take both sides of the medal and see where it leads. Be the bridge builder, not the one that pulls apart opinions so there's more diversity, but maybe bring them together so there's a middle ground somewhere. And there's always a middle ground somewhere. It just depends on how willingful people are to make those concessions. And unfortunately, the reason why, in my opinion, there's so much tension today is that no one is really wanting to make concessions, and any party is accusing the other party of bringing disinformation, misinformation, and so on. I think the only way we can really get over these crises and getting youth engaged but also respected in their opinion is to recognize that there's both sides of the medal, that there's concessions to be made, and there's a middle ground somewhere. I think that's something that we always forget, is to at least look at the middle ground and see what's what we have to do as our party, my opinion, and try to bridge a gap. But that doesn't happen if you're not seated at a table and discussing, and that rarely happens lately, unfortunately. Again, not sure. Sorry about the resources. Can't answer this because I'm not going to give you any false answer. But from experience and from what I'm seeing in the model United Nations, environment, and how we can discuss these topics with younger folks, is that make sure that you understand that there's a middle ground somewhere and work towards it with good intentions, and make sure that also your sources are accurate, because there's so much circulating lately. Yeah, that's sorry for the non-answer, but.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I also don't have any resources to share, but I also just really want to echo what Andrew has said. I think in today's geopolitical situation, it is extremely difficult to have that conversation and make compromises, especially like I said, in Chinese context, we've seen people having more and more extreme opinions, and it's been very hard for people to understand where each other are coming from, and also because the limited information we get in China, sometimes, especially for the young people, it's very hard for them like to understand how people with different opinions or from different cultural backgrounds like think and process information. So I think that's exactly why Model UN is very timely and relevant in this time and age, because it really provides a space for people to practice active listening and communication. And that's why actually we recently added that part into our conference. So at the beginning of the committee sessions, we actually have like a workshop on active listening and positive communication for people to really learn to listen to each other, to understand to understand people with different cultural backgrounds. I think that's very important. I'm very glad Model UN offers a space for students to do that.
Yeah, and just a minor additional thought. Not everything has to be confrontational. I think that I think about an unfortunate reality about multilateralism is there's not a lot of people out there making multilateral stuff cool and talking about it on TikTok. And, we talk about one of the goals of the Model UN resolution is to grant more legitimacy to Model UNs. So regardless of your, country-specific context, you can be a positive advocate for diplomacy and multilateralism and, contact your government and tell them to, be a vocal advocate in support of diplomacy, multilateralism, Model UN. Not everything has to be a confrontation, even if it feels like confrontation is the order of the day. So if you're not about that life, there are other things you can do. I guess that's my attitude, at least right now. Other questions? Oh, we've got 3. Why don't we we're getting short on time. Do all 3 of you want to come up? We'll take all 3 questions right in a row, and then we'll open it up to the panel to answer any and all that they would like. Please, I'll ask that you just try to keep it short. Go ahead.
Okay, it's a 2-part question, but it could be cut short. My question is, what challenges do diplomats face when advocating for vulnerable populations, especially children in conflict zones? And in international negotiations, how can child-focused organizations such as UNICEF ensure that their voices aren't drowned by political and economic priorities?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nathaniel. I'm a freshman at River Hill High School, and I was just wondering what, if any, opportunities there are for students to go maybe beyond Model UN and advocate for real change in the actual United Nations.
Well, my question was almost exactly like what he said. I'm also a freshman in high school, and I was just wondering, is it possible to take action both locally and within the actual UN outside of just like a Model UN committee classroom?
Thank you all. Open it up.
Actually, that's also one of my questions about like youth voices being more involved in Model UN. Like I said, we have a lot of students who do Model UN in China, and the question they often ask is how can we go beyond Model UN, right? So I'm also wondering if there's a possibility of like a clear youth voice kind of pathway for people where Model UN debates, resolutions can really go beyond simulation and the ideas can be heard and shared within the UN system, because I think that really will bridge the gap between simulation and real world diplomacy. So I'm also very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I can try to address. So taking the last questions first. So the first recommendation is join the diplomatic service. That's what I did. So I'm one of the youngest Portuguese diplomats to join the service because I was interested to work for the United Nations. That was since the beginning when I was studying economics. Most of my colleagues wanted to be CEO of Apple, Google, Facebook. They wanted to launch their startup, unicorn, whatever. I wrote in my letter that I wanted to become Secretary General of the UN. So yes, I joined the diplomatic service, passed the exams. The first task that I was given in 2015 when I joined was, there is a Portuguese candidate to become Secretary General of the UN. You'll be in his task force to make him elected for the job. And I was very happy, but very sad because it wasn't me. And of course, no other Portuguese will ever become Secretary General of the United Nations. But I made my dream come true to come to the UN, to apply, to do the diplomatic education, become a diplomat at the UN, one of the youngest among my colleagues, and to push forward resolutions, one of them being this one that we are talking about today, and I'm very proud to have contributed to that one, but also being, negotiator in all of the other topics, the Pact for the Future, the UN budget, and so on and so forth. So very straightforward recommendation to anyone who is interested to bringing simulations to action is become a diplomat. And I think you'll have a bright future for sure, because we need people with enthusiasm and motivation to change the world. But of course, we can also brainstorm about different ways of, if you have written a paper, negotiated a resolution that you believe is significant, brings about change or ideas for change, then of course the most straightforward recommendation is bring it to your missions at the UN. Try to reach out to diplomats who can, read it, think about it, do outreach, pitch for these ideas that you believe in, the causes that you defend or uphold through your NGOs, organizations. The UN has tons of conferences, as you know, along the year. We are just about to start the UN Youth Forum that happens every year in April, where young people can come, share their ideas, exchange their views about how the UN should do this and that, how the UN should be reformed, and how can we address global challenges. So there's, of course, many ways to speak up. And I encourage you to do so. Just 10 seconds on the vulnerable people, just to say that, of course, it's a challenging topic. Not all countries are very sensitive to, the concept of vulnerability, or don't have the same definition. There's different interest groups, as you were also mentioning. So of course it's a challenge. There's not a very straightforward answer for that one, unfortunately. But the key idea there, as a diplomat, it is to come up not just with long speeches with ideas of how a certain group is more vulnerable than the others and deserves attention, but also bring concrete examples, bring these vulnerable people to the discussion room to share their experiences. And these, I can tell you, makes a difference, because diplomats in the room, like me, who am jumping from meeting to meeting from 9 a.m. till evening, if I go to a room and there's someone that is not just in the UN bubble with, discussing whether a comma should come here or this verb is better than the other, but is sharing their views about what's happening in the Amazon rainforest, in Lake Chad, in Syria, concentration camps or deportation camps, you will have a more hands-on, humane testimony that can inspire, at least, do its best to inspire some type of change in a negotiation, in a discussion, and in a debate. Thank you.
I think I can add a little comment on, well, it was 3 questions, but 2 essentially. I'll start with the second one, which is advocate in the real world. I love Vitorino's answer, and but this happens for very little, very few people. Being able to reach to the UN, that's one, and being able to work at the UN is another difficulty that you're adding on. Not to prefer, but maybe on the parallel side is to advocate for grassroots solutions. And each and every one of us in this room can do this. Whether you're a diplomat, whether you're a student, whether you're a father, a mother, whoever you are, a professor, you can advocate and bring grassroots solutions. And my preferred method is to share your knowledge with your friends, your colleagues, your brother, sister, mother, cousin, whoever it is. I think just having this experience at the Model United Nations and having classes with your professors on diplomacy, on environmental studies, on whatever topic or discipline you're studying, but also experiences that you're gaining in the real life, sharing with your colleagues and friends. That's part of the solution, because action starts from the ground up and not the other way around. Unfortunately, I'm sorry for that, but we need people to empower and to take our recommendations and implement it in the higher spheres of societies and governance, and which I'm grateful for. But maybe a parenthesis is that to jump into the second question is, how do we kind of separate the work of the UN and not having it infringed on economic and political interests? There was a long question to it, and I'm sorry I didn't write it down, all of it. But this caught my attention because I'm taking off my hat of Model United Nations organization. I'm putting my hat of when I was a researcher and finishing my master's and conducting researches with professors. I specialize in humanitarian aid, and every time I spoke with an ambassador or a diplomat anywhere in the world, I got even more mad because of their answers. And the conclusion of my thesis was that we're better with a broken system than no system, unfortunately. So the way to go forward with it, and if there's a next step to it, is empower yourself and make sure that your voice is heard. Solution starts from grassroots. You have to speak with people that are in positions to take decisions. We have to share our ideas, make sure that we recognize that there's always a middle ground to any problem. We don't have to always be confrontational, but if we do have to do so, there's always a method to do it. And a right way to do it is to discuss it calmly with your ideas, your strong ideas, I believe, but making sure that you also listen actively. That's something that's being more and more diminished lately. But just jumping from one question to another is that solution starts with you. I know it could sound cheesy or idealistic, but there's realism to it, because we are the ones that take action, and then governance implement these actions. So I support anyone that wants to share their knowledge with whoever it is, and sometimes professors also do learn from students. So it's a two-way street. So thank you.
Great sentiment. We have like 2 minutes. Any closing thoughts or final sentiments that anyone wants to express?
Yeah, I'm just quickly gonna say something. I'm so glad to see like high school students asking this question, because I can remember exactly like about 10 years ago when I was a high school student sitting in Model UN, I probably have the same thought in my head, right? How do I get involved in the UN? But yeah, like Andrew said, it's actually not everyone make it to the UN, right? But then I think as you go, it's also important to ask yourself, like, why do you want to be involved in the UN? It's probably what also Andrew said, like you probably want to do something to make the world a better place, right? You probably want to do something to make the world more inclusive, equitable for people, right? So as I go, I also think about how can I do it through different means, right? And then as I go, I also realize, oh, I love education, and then maybe I can do this through creating meaningful learning experiences for young people, right? So yeah, thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Finn, did you have a quick closing thought?
Yeah, don't be discouraged. I want to say, even if progress maybe isn't as rapid as we sometimes want it to be, these are some great steps in the right direction that have been taken. And so it's a fantastic opportunity for us to discuss further what can be done. Right? And this is, I think, really important that we continue to build on the momentum. But at the same time, it's also good for us to discuss the challenges and where there might be, or what the reasons might be why the progress isn't as quick as sometimes we want it to be. But nonetheless, the progress is there. Let's not give up on it. Let's keep pushing. Let's keep on talking about model UN and making sure it's heard and seen at the UN. It's such a great opportunity for young people to engage with the UN. And it's one of the single largest gateways of how students really learn about the United Nations. So even if recognition is slow, it's starting to be there, and I think that's really great to see. And let's keep doing what we've been doing.
Thank you so much. Anything? Okay. Thank you all for this wonderful panel. I'll be giving some tchotchkes to the speakers, but please join me with a round of applause and thanking them for joining us today.